Good morning. Welcome to a new year, to a new term, and therefore to a new teaching series. For those of you that have been around for a while here, you will know that roughly speaking in the spring term, so this term, we spend some time looking at something from the Gospels. Then in the summer, we look at something from the rest of the New Testament, and in the autumn, we look at something from the Old Testament. And back in 2022, as the preaching team were preparing for last year's spring series, which was called Encounters with Jesus, we were thinking, well, there's so much material here that we could easily do 2 series on encounters with Jesus. And so last year we looked at 10. This year we're going to be looking at 9 encounters in the Gospels. 9 because Easter's early, so it's a slightly shorter term. And so these are the encounters that we're going to be looking at between now and Easter. Many of you will be aware that parallel to everything that we're going to be doing this year, we're also going to be thinking about Jesus' words on the Sermon on the Mount, and Karen has already mentioned that. The Sermon on the Mount comes from Matthew 5, 6, and 7. And so whether you're memorizing over the course of the year all 3 chapters, or whether you're engaging with the Bible Project resources, maybe their thing each week, their playlist, or their podcasts, or their videos. But however we are engaging with the words of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, I think for many of us throughout the course of this year, those words are going to be in the back of our heads through everything that we do. And one of the things that we pick up in those chapters in Matthew is some of the values that Jesus thinks are important, some of the values that are consistent with people that are living lives that are in step with God. And often we will see that those values are quite different to the values that our culture might prize and kind of elevate. If you've been looking at those verses so far, we're obviously 2 weeks in now, and we've seen and we prayed through some of these words just now. But Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, those who mourn, the meek, those who value righteousness." And a spoiler alert for those of you that have not read Matthew 5, 6, and 7 yet, some of the things that are going to come up are going to be things like, don't store up for yourselves treasures on earth. Love your enemies. Don't retaliate. Don't seek revenge against those who harm you. And so one of the things that I want us to do as we look at these 9 encounters this term is to think about, what do these stories show us about how Jesus treats people? Who are the sorts of people that Jesus meets with? What are the things that Jesus looks for in people? What are some of the things that Jesus wants for people? And I think wherever we live and whenever we live, I think it's really important that we're able to look at our own culture and look at the sorts of values that our culture raises up and celebrates, and the values that our culture pushes to one side, and evaluate those decisions that our culture has made from the perspective of Jesus' teaching, not just in the Sermon on the Mount, but in the whole of the Gospels. And then to evaluate those decisions and act accordingly. And so to ask, is this something in my culture that I can embrace and celebrate because it's in line with Jesus' values, or is this something that I need to watch out for, something I need to avoid, something I need to speak against and challenge? Now, Jesus didn't know very much about this first encounter that we're going to look at this year, the one that Carol read for us just now. This is one of the stories that Luke includes in as a part of his birth narrative, the Christmas story, but it's one that we often don't look at. Obviously, we don't look at it in the run-up to Christmas because the baby's already been born, and that would not be right. And then after Christmas, depending on whether there's a Sunday in between Christmas or New Year or not, but we're kind of very much on to the new year and looking at what's ahead and a new series. And so it's a story that's there, but we've often just kind of don't include it in when we're looking at the Christmas stuff. But if you were a young Jewish couple and you had a baby, then there were 3 ceremonies that you had to perform as laid out in the law. If you had a son, then at 8 days, he needed to be circumcised and named. At a month old, there was the redemption of the firstborn, and then at 40 days for a boy or 80 days for a girl, there was a ceremony for the purification of the mother. And we know from Luke chapter 2, verses 21, which we didn't read, through to 24, that Jesus' parents did all 3 of these. They did all that was required by the law. And we know from the sacrifice that Mary and Joseph brought that the event that we read about with Simeon and Anna would have been the last of these 3 ceremonies. It would have been for the purification of the mother. Mary, she'd have come to the temple and she'd have offered a lamb as a burnt offering and a young pigeon as a sin offering, as laid out in Leviticus chapter 12. But obviously we know that she didn't do that. She brought 2 doves or 2 pigeons, which is a concession in Leviticus chapter 12 for those families who could not afford to bring a lamb. And so just from these few verses, we know that Jesus came from a good Jewish family, a family that took the Old Testament law seriously, a family that made sure that everything was fulfilled. Everything was done that was supposed to be done. We also know that Jesus came from a poor family. One of the accusations that is often levelled against politicians is that they are out of touch with ordinary people. They're in this thing called the Westminster bubble, and they have no idea what things are really like for real people. But this is not an accusation that can be levelled at Jesus. In fact, the opposite charge is brought against Jesus, that he spends his time with all the wrong kinds of people, and that's one of the things that got him into trouble. Even though he was God, the message of the Christmas story is that he was a God who entered our world at the bottom of the pile, not at the top. That he knew what it was like to grow up in poverty. He knew what it was like to grow up in a family where you were always one failed crop or one unfair tax demand away from disaster. And so whatever it is that we need to bring to Jesus today, he is going to understand. He is going to know what it is that we are feeling, and he knows what it is that we are trying to deal with. And then we're introduced to these 2 wonderful old people, Simeon and Anna. Earlier on, I mentioned the importance of continually evaluating our culture from a kind of a biblical and godly perspective, to see where our culture's values are in line with God's and where they are not. And these next few paragraphs about what I'm going to say have been written and deleted and rewritten and deleted and edited and gone over a few times as I tried to find what is the right way to attack what I am about to say. What is the best way to talk about in this context how our culture views older people? And my conclusion is that I'm going to leave a lot of the gaps for you to fill in for yourselves rather than for me to say too much. But to say that we need to celebrate diversity as a church. Now, when you think about the different sorts of groups that exist in a typical community, there is probably nothing that is as diverse as the church. Where you think about the sorts of people that you could meet on a typical Sunday in church. They could come from a whole range of social, economic, professional, non-professional, old, young, all kinds of different nationalities. There is a real diversity within the church. Here's a photo from a well-known church planting book from 1990s America, in which part of the strategy is to identify your target audience. And broadly speaking, it doesn't say that all churches need to go after this particular target audience, but what they do say, or what they imply, is that church growth is a lot easier if it's done with a whole bunch of people who are just like me. That if everyone's the same, church growth is a lot easier to pursue than if everyone is different. And so each church needs to specialize at what it's good at and then let somebody else reach somebody else. Now, I wonder, is that a value? Is that a strategy? Is that an approach that is in line with Jesus' understanding? I think there is real value in diversity, and in the context of Anna and Simeon, I think there is real value in intergenerational church. And by that, I don't mean that we should have an all-age service every week, but I think it's about what happens in the service, what happens before the service, what particularly happens after the service, what happens in our home groups as we have a whole mix across the age spectrum, engaging with each other. And so for those of us that are younger, and I'm including myself in that bracket, we listen to the experience and the wisdom that comes from those who have lived longer than us, those who have seen more than us, those who've lived through more than us. But for those of us who are older, it can also be about learning from those who are younger, learning about this ever more rapidly changing world in which we live. What's it like for them? How can we engage with some of the things that just seem totally alien and foreign to us? And so it's about learning from each other. And so when someone like Paul describes the church as a body, he says that every person has a part to play. And that includes all of us, and specifically in the context of this particular kind of story that we've looked at today, those that are old and those that are young and everyone else in between. You know, when it comes to the church, retiring from active service at 65 is not a biblical value. It is for all of us. We all have a part to play, whether we are young, whether we are old. How we do what we do might well change. What we're able to do might well change, but there is still something for us all to do. There is still a way that we can all contribute. And so here you've got Anna and you've got Simeon, these two faithful Israelites. They've been waiting for years and years. They've been hoping for years and years. They've not given up believing in the promises that God had made. Now, I'm not a historian, and some of you will probably know much more about this than me, but Anna is 84 in this story. And so a quick search on the internet showed me that she'd have probably been in her 20s when the Romans moved in to the neighborhood. And so there would have been times in Anna's experience when it would have been really easy and really understandable to give up hope. You know, there'd already been 400 years of silence since the prophet Malachi, and now the Romans have come in and taken over. Life was hard, and I'm sure many people were asking, where is God in all of this? I've talked in the past about making links when we're reading the Bible between one part and another. For those of you that weren't around, we spent last term looking at the book of Isaiah, and at risk of being greeted by an overwhelming silence, I'm going to ask you a question to which I would like an answer. When we read in Luke chapter 2 that Simeon was waiting for the consolation of Israel, is there any part of our series from Isaiah that comes to mind? Excellent. I knew if no one else said anything, Mandy would. Comfort, comfort my people. From Isaiah chapter 40. When we were doing Isaiah, we said that chapters 1 to 39, they were predominantly about warning, they were predominantly about the threat of judgment, and then in chapter 40 to 66 there is this shift. And Isaiah starts to talk about hope for the future, an encouragement for the future. He starts to talk about the promise of the Messiah. And so I'm fairly sure that this phrase, the consolation of Israel, Luke wants our minds to be going to Isaiah chapter 40 and similar passages. If you don't believe me, have a look at the start of Luke chapter 3, and then you'll see this is definitely where Luke wants us to be going. And so here we've got two old, faithful people who know their Bibles. They know what God has promised. They know Isaiah 40 through to Isaiah 66. They know what God has said is going to happen. And no matter how bad things might have looked on the ground, they never gave up hope. They believe that God will do what he has said. Perseverance and commitment are values, again, that are not particularly celebrated today. I was reading an article last week somewhere. It was an article by an older actor, and she was talking about her frustrations with working with those from Gen Z. For those of you that don't know, so Gen Z are for those that were born between 1997 and 2012. So those who are 12 to 27 years old, they are Gen Z. And one of the things that this actor said was that she said, you'll just get a telephone call from them in the morning, and they'll say something like, I'm not feeling it today, so I'm not coming in. And they just wouldn't turn up for work because they just weren't feeling it. And whether it be a job, whether it be a responsibility, whether it be a relationship, if we're not really feeling it today, then we're encouraged to ditch it and move on to something else. There is always that option on the table. But sometimes the hardest thing to do is just keep on keeping on. To keep on believing. To keep on hoping. To keep on believing that God is going to do the things that he said he is going to do. Sometimes the hardest thing to do is just keep on turning up. But if Anna and Simeon had stopped believing, or they'd stopped hoping, or they just stopped showing up day after day, they'd have missed this encounter. They'd have missed the most important day in their lives. I've not talked at all about what either Anna or Simeon said. I've not got on to talk about Jesus being the fulfillment of the Old Testament, that Jesus being the one who would come and save his people, not just the Jews, but all people. Luke makes specific mention here to the Gentiles, and a lot of Luke's audience would have been Gentiles. That this was, as the angels said to the shepherds, this was good news for all people. But we have hints here from Simeon that This good news about Jesus isn't going to be universally accepted. Some people will respond, and we saw this in our Encounters with Jesus series last time. Some people will respond positively. Some people will respond with kind of indifference. Some people will respond with hostility. Simeon talks about the pain that Mary is going to experience, pointing us towards some of these conflicts that Jesus is having, and pointing us more specifically and ultimately to the cross. I think there are links here that do take us back to Malachi, to the end of the Old Testament. There is reference, we know Anna, we're told she's from the tribe of Asher. I think, why is that? Why is that there? Why is that relevant? I think there were times back when we were doing our series through kind of Samuel and Kings and all that kind of stuff when things went wrong. I think there would have been faithful Israelites in the north who made their way south. And so Anna would have been the result of one of these. A family that moved from their tribe in the north saw what we're doing is wrong. We need to go south. We need to go to Jerusalem. And so God has kept, again linking back to the end of the Old Testament, God has kept this remnant from all of Israel. And he's going to do what he said he will do. Some of those things we are going to pick up in home groups. Home group notes will resume this week. But there's lots more that I could say that I'm not going to say, but watch out for some stuff coming out this week. I'm going to pray, and then I'm going to hand back to Karen.